When we think of the Celts, we often picture fierce warriors, bearded men in animal skins, and legendary dragons in their myths. But beneath this tough, warrior-like image lies another, more mystical side of Celtic culture's secret rites and customs tied to their ancient priests, the Druids. These were not just religious leaders, but sages who possessed knowledge of nature, magic, and philosophy. Their world was filled with magic connected to the forces of nature, and unique rituals where people could communicate with the spirit world. The Druids played a central role in Celtic tribes, starting from the late Bronze Age and continuing into the early Middle Ages, when Christianity began to spread across Europe. However, few are aware that even during these dark ages, when their cults and rituals were branded as heresy and driven out of mainstream, religious practices the Druids still held a significant influence over. Europe can continue to symbolize ancient magic and nature. Before delving into the magical practices and rituals of the Druids, it's important to understand the foundation of their mystical philosophy. Their view of the world differed from the Christian, or even the ancient Greek perspective. For the Druids, nature wasn't just a material world. It was a living, conscious entity that deserved reverence and care. They saw the world as a complex network of interconnected elements, from trees and rivers to the stars in the sky and storms at sea. Every element of nature held power and wisdom, and humanity's task was to live in harmony with this world. Their spiritual practices were rooted in animism, the ancient belief system that spirits inhabit every part of the natural world. The Druids believed that the spirits of their ancestors continued to watch over them, guiding their actions and protecting them from harm. These spirits weren't distant or detached from the living. They were present, active, and influential in the daily lives of the Druids. Through ritual offerings, prayers, and ceremonies, the Druids honored their ancestors and the spirits of the land, seeking their guidance and protection. One of the most famous ceremonies associated with the Druids was the sacrifice ritual. While this aspect of Celtic culture often evokes negative associations, it's important to understand that sacrifices were not always violent or harsh. They were often symbolic actions meant to establish communication with the gods and spirits. For instance, animal sacrifices, particularly of white horses or bulls, might have been made to appease the gods or ask for blessings on crops or victory in battle. Secrecy was also an essential aspect of Druidic rituals. Knowledge of the sacred rites was passed only to a chosen few, and ceremonies were often held at night or in secluded locations, away from the eyes of outsiders. Even as the Druids were persecuted by Roman conquerors and Christian missionaries, their rituals continued to be carried out in secret, hidden from those considered unworthy. Some of the most famous rituals involved seasonal festivals tied to the solar and lunar cycles. For example, Samhain, the Celtic New Year, celebrated at the end of October, was a time when the spirits of ancestors would return to the world of the living. It was a moment when the Druids would use their magic to help people communicate with the souls of the dead and protect themselves from malevolent spirits. On this day, bonfires were lit in which symbolic sacrifices were burned, and feasts and dances were held to honor the returning spirits. Another important festival was Beltane, celebrated in early May, marking the beginning of the agricultural season. During Beltane, Druids would hold rituals outdoors, lighting large fires which people would leap over to cleanse themselves of illness and bring good fortune. Fire was considered a powerful magical element, and it played a central role in nearly all Druidic rites. As we explore the world of the Druids, it's clear that their spiritual beliefs were inextricably linked to the natural world. The rituals they performed were not just ceremonial. They were designed to maintain balance and harmony with nature's forces. This deep connection to the land and its cycles was a central tenet of Druidic philosophy, guiding their daily lives and actions. The Druids' connection to nature was also reflected in their sacred spaces, the groves, hills, and rivers that served as their temples. These places were considered holy, where the physical world and the spirit world intersected. The most famous of these sacred groves were those located in ancient forests, where the Druids could commune with the gods and conduct rituals in peace. The Druidic rituals were deeply rooted in the land itself, and the act of performing ceremonies in these spaces was a way of acknowledging the sacredness of the earth. While much of Druidic culture has been lost to time, its influence remains powerful. The very idea of a nature-based religion, one that emphasizes reverence for the earth and the elements, continues to resonate today. Modern neo-pagan movements, such as Druidry, often draw inspiration from the ancient practices of the Druids, incorporating elements of their rituals and philosophy into contemporary spiritual practices. In the next section, we'll dive deeper into the role of the Druid priesthood and the spiritual leaders who guided these rituals. We'll explore the Druids' duties within their communities, their roles as healers, philosophers, and judges, and how their spiritual practices shaped the everyday lives of the Celtic people. In the world of the ancient Celts, Druids were far more than just religious leaders. They were revered as spiritual guides, healers, and philosophers. Their wisdom and knowledge were essential to the social and cultural fabric of Celtic life. The Druidic priesthood was a deeply complex and highly respected institution, one that held considerable power within Celtic tribes. From serving as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal world to guiding their people through the trials of life, the Druids were essential figures in maintaining balance within society. One of the key roles of the Druids was as spiritual guides. They were seen as the keepers of sacred knowledge, possessing an understanding of the world that went far beyond the physical realm. The Celts believed that the Druids had the ability to communicate with the gods, spirits, and ancestors, and it was through them that the people sought wisdom and guidance. These priestly figures were often consulted during important life events, such as births, marriages, and deaths, to ensure that the rites and rituals were performed correctly, maintaining the connection between the living and the spiritual world. Druids were also regarded as healers in Celtic society. Their knowledge of plants, herbs, and the natural world made them indispensable in the realm of medicine. They understood the therapeutic properties of various plants and could concoct remedies for a variety of ailments. It is said that the Druids often used plants such as mistletoe and yew in their healing practices, believing that these plants had powerful magical properties. Mistletoe, for example, was considered to be a sacred plant, especially because it grew on trees without rooting in the ground, making it a symbol of life's resilience and power. As healers, Druids didn't just focus on the physical aspect of medicine. They were also concerned with the spiritual well-being of individuals. They believed that illness could be caused by spiritual imbalance or the anger of the gods. For this reason, Druids often combined their medical knowledge with their spiritual practices. Healing rituals might involve the use of sacred symbols, prayers, or incantations to address both the body and the soul. In many ways, the Druids viewed healing as a holistic practice, where physical, mental, and spiritual health were all interconnected. Another significant role of the Druids was that of judges within their communities. Celtic society was based on a system of customary law, and the Druids were tasked with upholding these laws, serving as arbiters of disputes and offering counsel in matters of justice. Because they were seen as intermediaries between the divine and human realms, the Druids were expected to possess not only wisdom, but also impartiality and fairness. Their decisions were often considered binding, and their judgments were believed to reflect the will of the gods. In this capacity, the Druids were also responsible for administering punishments for wrongdoings. While their role in law enforcement is somewhat unclear due to the scarcity of written records, it's believed that the Druids could impose penalties for crimes, ranging from fines to more severe consequences. They played a crucial role in maintaining the social order, ensuring that the Celtic tribes functioned harmoniously and that justice was served. Druids also served as philosophers. They were thinkers and intellectuals, and many of them dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge. They were highly educated and trained for many years in a tradition of oral learning, memorizing vast amounts of knowledge that were passed down through generations. Their training encompassed not only religious and spiritual teachings, but also history, astronomy, law, and ethics. The Druids were thought to possess a deep understanding of the natural world and the cosmos, and they often held a significant role in determining the timing of agricultural and seasonal events, based on their knowledge of the movements of the stars and the cycles of the sun. The Druids' role as philosophers was not limited to their immediate communities. They were also known to travel and exchange knowledge with other cultures. In the centuries before the Roman conquest, the Druids maintained close ties with their counterparts in other Celtic regions, such as Gaul and Ireland, and their wisdom was sought after across the ancient world. They were regarded as the intellectual elite, not only in matters of religion, but also in the sciences and ethics. One of the most fascinating aspects of Druidic philosophy was their belief in the immortality of the soul. The Druids held that the soul was eternal and that it would continue to live after death, passing through various cycles of reincarnation. This belief in the cycle of life and death was central to their view of the universe. It provided a framework for understanding the constant flow of life, how everything is in a state of change, and how every end is merely the beginning of a new phase. This view of the soul's immortality was deeply tied to their connection with the natural world, where death was seen not as an end, but as part of a natural cycle of rebirth. Druidic education was a lifelong process, with aspiring Druids undergoing extensive training. It is believed that they spent as long as 20 years learning the ancient knowledge that was passed down orally from teacher to student. This rigorous training was focused on the memorization of sacred texts, stories, hymns, and rituals, as well as the learning of ethical and legal systems. The Druids were deeply committed to preserving their traditions and knowledge, which they believed had been given to them by the gods themselves. In the next section, we'll explore the sacred spaces where the Druids conducted their rituals, the significance of the natural elements in their practices, and the role of sacred groves, hills, and rivers in connecting with the divine. These spaces were integral to the Druidic way of life and played a vital role in maintaining the spiritual and natural balance of the Celtic world. For the Druids, nature wasn't just the world around them. It was an active, living participant in their spiritual and ritualistic practices. Sacred groves, hills, rivers, and trees were not mere physical locations, but deeply spiritual sites that connected the physical world to the divine realm. The Druids believed that these places held a unique power, a sacred energy that allowed them to communicate with the gods, honor their ancestors, and maintain balance within their communities. Sacred groves, the heart of Druidic rituals. The most sacred spaces in Druidic culture were the groves, which were often found in ancient forests. These groves, typically made up of oak trees, were considered the dwelling places of the gods and spirits. The oak, in particular, was sacred to the Druids because it was believed to be the tree that held the wisdom of the gods. The Druids would gather in these groves to perform their most important rituals, such as seasonal festivals, divination, and sacrifices. The groves were more than just a gathering place for the Druids. They were considered the very center of the world. They were where the celestial forces met the earth, where the natural and spiritual worlds overlapped. The Druids believed that by holding their rituals in these sacred groves, they could align themselves with the cosmic forces that governed the universe. It was said that the trees in these groves had a special ability to communicate with the Druids, with each tree representing a different aspect of nature, wisdom, or divine power. One of the most significant rituals performed in these groves was the Samhain festival, which marked the Celtic New Year. This festival, which took place at the end of October, was a time when the Druids believed the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was thinnest. The Druids would gather in the groves to honor their ancestors, commune with spirits, and perform divination to foretell the future. Bonfires were lit in these groves, and the people would jump over the flames for purification and protection in the coming year. These fires were believed to be sacred, imbued with the power to cleanse the community of evil spirits and misfortune. The role of rivers and hills in Druidic practices. While the groves were central to Druidic rituals, rivers and hills also held great significance in their spiritual practices. Rivers, in particular, were seen as sacred pathways to the underworld. The Druids believed that the flow of water symbolized the flow of life, and that rivers could act as conduits between the living and the dead. Sacred rivers, such as the River Thames in England and the River Severn in Wales, were often associated with the gods, and offerings were made to them in the form of coins, weapons, and other valuables. Hills, on the other hand, were seen as the homes of the gods themselves. The Druids believed that the highest points in the land, such as hilltops and mountains, were places where the spiritual world was most accessible. These hills were often the sites of major ceremonies, where the Druids would perform rituals to honor the gods of nature and ask for their blessings. One of the most famous hills associated with Druidic practice is Stonehenge, the ancient stone circle in England. Though its exact purpose remains a mystery, many scholars believe that Stonehenge was used by the Druids as a site for astronomical observations and seasonal rituals, aligning with the cycles of the sun and moon. The Druids' connection to these natural features was not just symbolic. It was a lived experience. They believed that the world around them was infused with divine energy, and that by attuning themselves to the rhythms of nature, whether through the trees in the groves, the flow of the rivers, or the heights of the hills, they could access deeper wisdom and understanding of the universe. Seasonal festivals, the rhythm of life and death. The Druids' rituals were closely tied to the cycles of nature, particularly the changing seasons. For them, the year was a cycle of life, death, and rebirth, reflected in the changing of the seasons. Their most important festivals were based on these seasonal transitions, marking the turning of the wheel of the year. Imbolc, celebrated on February 1st, was one of the first major festivals of the year. It marked the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. Imbolc was a time of purification and light, a time to celebrate the first signs of spring. The Druids would light candles and clean their homes, symbolizing the cleansing of darkness and the welcoming of the light. This festival was dedicated to Brigid, the goddess of fire, poetry, and fertility, and it was believed that by honoring her during this time, the people could ensure a successful harvest and a prosperous year. Beltane, celebrated on May 1st, was a fire festival marking the beginning of the growing season. It was a time of renewal, fertility, and celebration of life. Bonfires were lit to honor the sun, and people would dance around the fire, jump over the flames for purification, and celebrate the awakening of the earth. This festival was dedicated to the god Belenus, a Celtic sun god, and was seen as a time to strengthen the connection between the people and the divine forces that governed life. Lughnasadh, celebrated in early August, was a harvest festival. It marked the first fruits of the season and was a time of thanksgiving for the abundance of nature. During this festival, the Druids would offer sacrifices to the gods, particularly to Law, the god of light and craftsmanship. The people would gather to celebrate the harvest, and the Druids would perform rituals to ensure a bountiful crop for the coming months. Finally, Samhain, celebrated on October 31st, was the most significant festival of the Druidic calendar. This was the time when the Druids believed that the veil between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, and it was the time for honoring ancestors and communing with spirits. Bonfires were lit, offerings were made, and the community gathered together to celebrate both life and death. It was a time of reflection, connection, and renewal, the enduring legacy of Druidic rituals. Although the Druids themselves have largely disappeared from history, their spiritual and ritualistic legacy continues to influence modern spiritual practices. The festivals they celebrated, the reverence they held for the natural world, and their belief in the interconnectedness of all life resonate with modern pagan and Wiccan practices. The Druids' respect for nature, their deep understanding of the cycles of life, and their focus on harmony and balance offer valuable insights for our time, reminding us of the importance of reconnecting with the natural world and honoring the forces that shape our lives. In the next section, we will explore the decline of Druidic culture and the forces that led to their suppression, as well as how the legacy of Druidism has survived in modern times. We will also look at how their practices were distorted or mythologized by Roman and Christian sources, and what remnants of their traditions can still be found in the world today. The Druids were not long destined to remain free and powerful in the mystical, forested groves of ancient Europe. With the rise of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity, the ancient Druidic ways began to crumble. These once revered figures of power and knowledge were soon branded as enemies of the state and heretics, hunted by both the sword and the pen. The decline of Druidic culture began in earnest with the Roman conquest of Gaul and Britain. Julius Caesar, who was among the first Roman leaders to encounter the Druids, described them as powerful figures that held considerable sway over Celtic society. The Druids were seen as a threat to the Roman Empire, particularly because of their influence over the people and their deeply rooted resistance to Roman conquest. In 54 BCE, Caesar famously declared war on the Druids, stating that their religious influence was a destabilizing force and a threat to Roman control. He was particularly concerned with their ability to unite the various Celtic tribes, which posed a significant challenge to Roman authority. The Romans responded by systematically targeting Druidic centers, including sacred groves and places of worship, and destroying the physical and spiritual power of the Druids. Many were killed or driven into exile. The Roman assault on Druidic culture was both violent and cultural. Not only did they attack the Druids physically, but they also worked to erase their religious and philosophical practices from the cultural landscape. The sacred groves were cut down, temples were burned, and many Druidic texts were lost to history. Roman writers, such as Pliny the Elder and Tacitus, wrote disparagingly about the Druids, framing them as superstitious and backward. These accounts, while valuable, were also deeply biased and played a significant role in shaping the negative image of the Druids for future generations. As the Roman Empire spread Christianity across Europe, the decline of Druidic practices accelerated. The new Christian faith, which was deeply monotheistic, viewed Druidic polytheism and nature-based spirituality as a threat to their doctrines. Christian missionaries, such as St. Patrick in Ireland, actively sought to eliminate the old pagan traditions, including those of the Druids. In many places, the Druids were replaced by Christian clergy, and the rites of nature, gods, and ancestors were reinterpreted or erased altogether. The Church, with its growing influence, eventually outlawed Druidic practices, branding them as heretical. Those who continued to practice Druidic rituals in secret were persecuted, often accused of witchcraft or sorcery. Over time, the Druids disappeared as an organized priesthood, their sacred knowledge largely lost to the ages. However, even as their formal power was wiped away, elements of Druidic thought and practice did not vanish entirely. In some isolated areas, particularly in Celtic regions such as Ireland and Wales, remnants of Druidic beliefs and practices continued to influence the local culture. Folk traditions, seasonal festivals, and the reverence for nature that the Druids held so dear lingered in the form of local customs, even as their original spiritual practices faded from view. Though the Druids were driven underground by both Roman and Christian forces, their legacy has never been entirely extinguished. Over the centuries, elements of their culture and spiritual practices were preserved through oral traditions and folk tales. These elements of Druidic thought lived on, influencing literature, art, and philosophy, and were sometimes reinterpreted in more favorable light as the world entered the modern era. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as part of the broader Romantic movement, there was a revival of interest in ancient cultures, including the Druids. Writers, poets, and artists began to romanticize Druidic life, portraying them as wise, mystical figures closely attuned to nature. This resurgence in Druidic imagery became a part of the Celtic Renaissance, a cultural movement that sought to revive and preserve the ancient traditions of the Celts. In modern times, Druidry has experienced a kind of spiritual rebirth. Neo-Druidic practices, though not directly linked to the ancient Druids, have emerged as part of contemporary paganism and environmentalism. Many modern-day Druids focus on the worship of nature, the cycles of the seasons, and the reverence for the earth. These modern Druids often gather to celebrate the same seasonal festivals like Samhain and Beltane that their ancient predecessors did, though they are practiced in a more symbolic and ecological context today. In addition to the spiritual revival, Druidic imagery has been embraced in popular culture, often associated with mystical forests, ancient rites, and the enigmatic power of nature. Films, books, and television shows continue to feature Druids, sometimes as wise sages, other times as mysterious and shadowy figures whose knowledge of the natural world gives them near magical abilities. The Druids' connection to the land and their deep wisdom about the cycles of life continue to inspire people who seek to reconnect with the earth in a more meaningful and spiritual way. While the formal institution of the Druids may have disappeared centuries ago, their mystical connection to nature, their wisdom, and their spirituality continue to captivate the imagination of modern society. Whether through neo-pagan rituals, environmental activism, or simply the timeless fascination with their mysterious and arcane practices, the Druids' legacy is far from forgotten. As we reflect on the Druids' enduring influence, it's clear that their practices and philosophy were ahead of their time. In an age where humanity's relationship with nature is often disconnected, the Druidic teachings remind us of the power and wisdom that comes from living in harmony with the world around us. The ancient Druids, though long gone, continue to inspire us to seek deeper understanding, to honor the natural world, and to reconnect with the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth that they once so deeply understood. The story of the Druids is one of survival, secrecy, and spiritual depth. It is a reminder that even when the forces of history seem to sweep away ancient cultures and beliefs, the essence of those traditions can endure, quietly influencing the future. And so, as we honor the Druids' legacy, we keep their message alive, not only in the rituals and festivals that still mark the passing of the seasons, but in the spirit of reverence for nature and the mysteries that continue to elude us.